The members of the Dawn Alliance looked at the three-headed dog nervously. They worried about leaving Charles alone with such a powerful creature. "If it wanted to do something to me, you wouldn't be able to stop it anyway," Charles said with a laugh. His personal followers looked hurt by his jibe, and many of them cast their eyes down in humiliation. They had chosen to follow Charles initially because they saw a benefit in it for themselves. Many of them didn't have personal connections, and they were uncertain about following someone so egotistical simply because he was powerful. But when Charles had given them more benefits, especially in comparison to the other members of the Alliance, it had filled them with a sense of satisfaction and pride. They received a great deal of respect within the group for being close to Charles. Their pride also encouraged their sense of loyalty. Once Charles had displayed his immense power, they had naturally trusted him more. After all, the Alliance still offered even people without paranormal abilities benefits that only a paranormal could enjoy in other groups. Charles was the only one who could give them that. They had therefore decided to settle for him as a leader in exchange for their own increased status. Most of them felt that they deserved to enjoy that kind of treatment. It was the result of their hard work, they decided. There was an air of entitlement among them. They had been relatively happy with the arrangements initially. However, they had failed to recognize one thing. Since Charles was responsible for giving them all of the benefits, he was also offering the same advantages to everyone else. Their benefits had been obtained through hard work, but the opportunity to distribute them is ultimately decided by Charles. The incident earlier in the day had been a warning bell for them. They had collectively realized one thing, and that was how little help they could provide him. All of them were deeply uncomfortable with this newly discovered knowledge, because they knew that none of them were irreplaceable. But in the face of real danger, they would be of no real use to Charles. In fact, they might even hold him back. When Charles and Miranda had faced the tentacular cadavers, the others had only been able to watch helplessly from the sideline as the creature had moved from one zombie host to another. Miranda noticed the others' gloomy expressions and sighed. "I hope that today's incident doesn't make them feel too ashamed," she said to Charles. "We needed to bolster their bravery, not make them feel weak." She knew that when people were faced with setbacks or difficulties, not everyone was able to confront them. As a result of the apocalypse, many people have been unable to adapt to the new era and have been subsequently eliminated by the new challenges. Only a small number of people would be able to survive, so she didn't want to lose soldiers for the sake of nothing. Charles didn't answer her. Instead, he approached Cerberus as it was enjoying its meal. "Do you want to enjoy these delicacies more often?" he asked it. The creature looked annoyed. Then it said, "Don't patronize me, human. If you want to ask me to be a long-term contract piece for you, then ask. But I can tell you the answer is no." Charles was embarrassed. Cerberus was a high-level hellhound, and so it didn't make a habit of talking about trivial things. Charles had assumed he could use his intelligence to lure it into a contract, but it had seen right through his small talk. But Charles had no intention of giving up. "I don't consider my pacts as long-term contracts," Charles told it. "They're more of an equal exchange. Both of us will benefit from the relationship. I'm not asking something for nothing." The beast didn't bother to reply, and Charles knew he had to try harder. "In any case, as my strength increases, I'll be able to offer more sacrifices for you," he said. "I know that I summoned you by accident this time, but when my strength reaches a higher level in the imminent future, I can promise it'll be worth your while to respond to my requests." Cerberus thought for a moment, and then it shook its head. "No," it said. "The pride of my species means that I can't allow myself to submit to a weaker creature. You might think that what you're suggesting is an equal exchange, but since you're the one initiating it, it's absolutely impossible for me to agree." Disappointment flashed in Charles's eyes. He understood that if he wanted to engage the monster in any way, it would have to be on the beast's terms. It was apparent that the creature wouldn't approve of feeling inferior in any way, and Charles would have to ensure that he was providing an equal opportunity. He knew it was unlikely that the Hellhound would fall for a trick, but he knew he had to try. "So in that case," he said, "if I can prove that I'm stronger than you are, you'll surrender to me?" A mocking expression that seemed surprisingly human appeared on Cerberus's face. "There are many creatures stronger than me," he replied. But do you think I ever submit to them? Hellhounds refused to submit to lower creatures, but that didn't mean that they had any intention of being used by creatures that were more powerful than themselves either. Charles suddenly felt uncomfortable. The beast was looking down on him, and he wasn't used to being condescended to. He had thought he might use a technicality to persuade the beast, but it seemed that had been mistaken. The Hellhound's appearance was deceptive. It looked like a canine, which gave Charles the impression that its temperament was also like that of a dog. However, it was now clear that it didn't have a submissive bone in its body. Charles had also been surprised by how sharp and quick-witted the creature was. When Miranda saw that Charles was affected by the rejection, she patted his shoulder sympathetically. But the gesture made Charles feel even more frustrated. He had felt awkward enough being labeled a weaker creature, but he was even more embarrassed that Miranda had pitied him enough to offer him comfort. But before Charles could admit defeat, he was struck by a flash of inspiration. Since Cerberus was obviously not about to submit based on Charles's strength, he needed to find out what the creature wanted. He remembered how the beast hadn't liked it when he had previously danced around the subject, so he was sure to phrase his question directly. "Since you claim that I have your loyalty mark on me," Charles said, "what conditions do I have to fulfill before you're willing to listen to my orders?" The last time he had summoned Cerberus had been an accident, because he had been too weak to control the process. He had subsequently been forced to trick the monster back to hell. This time, though, he felt as though he needed to maintain a degree of self-preservation, so he mustered up the confidence to bargain. He managed to calm his anxiety and gather his thoughts. He refused to believe that he was inferior to the creature. He had a significant amount of power, and the speed at which he had cultivated his strength was much faster than in his previous life. He decided that even if he couldn't obtain Cerberus's loyalty, his future was still bright. He reminded himself that the Hellhound was only an additional support measure, and far from being an essential part of his plans. Charles resolutely decided that obtaining the Hellhound's loyalty was validation for his ego, more than a necessity for his survival. He knew that once he became truly powerful, he would look down on the beast as though it were a pet. He was only determined to secure the creature as an ally because it seemed unobtainable. But at the same time, he couldn't rid himself of his unyielding determination to have what he wanted. Charles had never been the kind of person who excelled at public speaking. Although he had managed to secure the loyalty of everyone in the Alliance through his previous speeches, it hadn't been because he was a particular good orator, but because he knew what people wanted to hear. He was also a master of timing. Whenever someone was in a desperate situation, even if they hadn't specified their circumstances, Charles knew if he could gain their trust while they were vulnerable, they would pledge him their loyalty forever. When he realized that he had no way to trick Cerberus, Charles decided to reveal his intentions openly. In his bitterness, he decided that the Hellhound was powerful, but it was only a level 6 monster. It had the capability to display the power of a level 7, but it couldn't hold on to that power for long. Charles no longer lacked resources or crystal cores. Reaching level 5 was only a matter of time, and once he achieved it, he would have the ability to condense divine seeds. When he could do that, the entire world would be at his mercy, and no one would be able to stand in his way. According to the memories from his previous life, once the Lightning Cadaver Serpent reached level 5, it would also undergo an essential transformation. Since Charles had passed through the Gate of Life and Death, he understood how the process worked. If Cerberus were to pledge him its loyalty, it would only be useful for a finite amount of time. Once he and the Lightning Cadaver Serpent both reached level 5, a Hellhound was likely to be of little use to him. Alice noticed Cerberus and went over to stand by Charles's side. "It's you again," she said pleasantly to the monster. "What are you doing here? Did Charles summon you by mistake again?" She eyed Charles suspiciously and assumed the Hellhound's presence was due to an error of some kind. Cerberus looked at Alice with glowing eyes. "So that's how you managed it," it said to Charles. "I knew it." Alice had the power of the Gate of Hell. One of its functions was expanding the entrance to the passageway to Hell. Under normal circumstances, Charles's level 4 summoning spell couldn't summon monsters beyond his own level. But his proximity to Alice had evidently expanded his ability. Charles flushed and changed the subject back. "You haven't said your conditions yet," he exclaimed. This is the only chance you have to negotiate with me. He didn't care how he had managed to summon the beast. He wasn't about to miss the opportunity. Cerberus thought for a moment. Then it heaved its huge body out of the thick fog, revealing grayish-brown fur and some rotting skin beneath. In some places, Charles could even see white bones. The Cerberus pack guards the underworld gate, the creature explained. 20,000 years ago, someone challenged the Lord of the Underworld's authority, and most of our pack was wiped out during the battle. In order to punish us for our failure, the Lord of the Underworld stripped us of our identities as guardians. He placed a curse on our bloodline that limited all our powers. Since then, the enemies that we made have managed to find most of us that survive, and have almost wiped us out. From what the Hellhound said, it sounded to Charles as though the ancestors of the Cerberus pack had fought bravely during the battle, which meant that they had done their best to protect the underworld. To punish them so harshly seemed to be an overreaction. Alice hadn't given much thought to the Lord of the Underworld, but she now considered that he must be a terrible figure. She looked like she couldn't bear to hear such a horrible tale. "He cursed your bloodline?" she whispered. "That's too cruel." "Who are you, little girl, to pass judgment on the Lord of the Underworld?" the Hellhound snarled. The beast seemed offended by her remark, as if the Lord of the Underworld was an entity that was above reproach. "Our pack made a terrible error," it said, "and we must accept our punishment. To fail in one's duty is the biggest mistake of all. If the Lord of the Underworld had been overthrown and our pack was to blame, who would have maintained the balance between life and death?" Alice was annoyed by the lecture. "I was only saying it wasn't fair," she muttered. "I don't know why you're so angry." Charles intervened. "Our moral values are different from the Cerberus pack," he told her hurriedly. "There's no need to force our views on them." When it came to the upper echelons of the underworld, Charles was a novice. There weren't many records in the ancient books he possessed. What he did know, however, was that the Lord of the Underworld was an extremely just being. He never made judgments that were based on his own preferences. Since he had determined that the Cerberus pack ought to suffer, Charles thought Cerberus was right to accept the punishment. He agreed with Alice that the decision seemed heartless, but since the Cerberus pack had chosen to accept it, there was no reason to doubt the Lord of the Underworld's authority. "So why are you telling me all this?" Charles asked Cerberus. It appeared the Cerberus pack had regained its reputation in Hell, but their powers were still sealed. Charles had only witnessed the limited power of one Hellhound, and he couldn't help but wonder what it would look like to see the whole pack at its peak. "We have no complaints about our punishment," the beast said. "We only want an opportunity to restore the former glory of our ancestors. Unfortunately, we seem unlikely to ever get that chance, because the curse has severely restricted our powers. We're loyal to our master. When he appeared after the battle, he restored hope to the Cerberus pack, which had been on the verge of elimination." The Hellhound's eyes filled with reverence for its master, and Charles thought the animal suddenly seemed more canine. "He sealed our curse," Cerberus continued. "He also gave us a place to rest and recover, and the chance to regain our strength. From that moment, the Cerberus pack decided to pledge its loyalty to our master for all eternity." Once Charles heard the full story, he no longer saw the Hellhounds as an inferior species. Miranda, Kevin, and the others also seemed to have gained more respect for them. No matter the situation, people often admired those who displayed loyalty and remained true to their word. And from what Cerberus had said, the Cerberus pack was a group worthy of respect. They didn't resent being punished for their mistakes. They just wanted to make up for them. It also seemed that the reason they were loyal to their master was that he had said they could work to take back their honor. "It seems as though you've proven your loyalty," Charles said carefully. "So why is your curse still in place? Is this master you speak of not able to lift it?" When he asked the question, he felt slightly apprehensive that the creature might ask him to break it. If that was the case, Charles was certain he wouldn't be able to lift it either. He couldn't see how he could possibly achieve something that had been impossible for such a powerful master. The Hellhound's tone was affected by grief.
"Our master hasn't appeared for 1,000 years,"
it said.
"His loyalty mark was transferred to you. I'm afraid that he may have met with misfortune. The reason he sealed the curse instead of removing it entirely wasn't because he couldn't, but because we told him not to."
"You don't want to?" Charles asked. "But I thought you said you wanted to regain the glory of your ancestors." None of them could understand why the pack wanted to remain oppressed. As if it could read everyone's thoughts, Cerberus raised its head high into the air.
"Being cursed is a punishment we deserve,"
it exclaimed sanctimoniously.
"It's the price we must pay for failing our master. What we want is the chance to regain our honor, and we'll use what's left of our power to regain the glory that belongs to our pack. Once we've proven ourselves worthy, we can completely remove the curse."
Everyone was shocked. Miranda sighed deeply. "I've seen a lot this month," she admitted. "I've met a lot of people who've resorted to terrible things because of the pressures of survival, but I've never known anyone who would voluntarily live with a curse for thousands of years just to restore the glory of their ancestors." At that moment, she felt that the pack's persistence put her own to shame. She had known many people who had ended up losing their humanity and sacrificing their principles in order to survive. Some of them were completely unable to relate to other humans anymore. Once they had lost their compassion, there had been no way for them to turn back. But for every person she had seen lose their humanity, there were others who revered it. Kevin had a look of determination on his face. He had doubted his own path many times. There were moments when he felt his life had lost its meaning. But when he heard how the Cerberus pack had owned their failure and had channeled it into determination, he felt inspired. "Do you want me to help you lift the curse?" Charles asked. Cerberus had earned his respect. He knew how much people liked to mourn the things they had lost. They believed that the past was more important than the future. Even he had fallen victim to that way of thinking. He had lost many attributes he valued during his quest for survival, but at least he'd managed to find them again in others around him. Some beings had traits that he considered so precious that he would defend them until he drew his last breath. The Hellhound's tone was filled with doubt and disdain.
"This is a bloodline curse, placed by the Lord of the Underworld himself," he said. "Although its power has weakened with the passage of time, lifting it isn't something that you can even consider at your level."
The Lord of the Underworld was an unequaled being. He could stir up a storm with a single word. If he moved, it could make 1,000 people shiver. Only a great master had the ability to resist the power contained in his curse.
"This human has obtained my master's inheritance," Cerberus thought. "But how can such a weak being be capable of wielding such power?"
"We won't know if I don't try," Charles replied with a shrug. The Hellhound sneered.
"Since the loyalty mark of our pack has been given to you, I promise that if you can control us, I'll lend you my strength. If you can finish sealing the blood curse, then we'll acknowledge you as our true master."
Although Cerberus was excited at the prospect of partially lifting the curse, it refused to let go of its ties to its former master entirely. It was loyal because of the person its master was, not because of his power. But since its master had been absent for so long, it saw no reason it couldn't be loyal to another. Neither it nor the rest of its pack had been given a clear order. So even though Charles had inherited the old master's loyalty mark, he would have to earn the pack's recognition on his own. The loyalty mark was a chance for Charles to prove himself. Otherwise, the Hellhound would never have paid him any attention at all. Charles approached Cerberus' side. "Charles, be careful," Alice cried out in alarm. "It'll be okay," Miranda said. "I know it's just an instinct, but I can feel that the Hellhound is telling the truth." She didn't know if it was her trusting nature or her intuition, but she was willing to believe that there was a creature in the world that valued glory and duty more than life. People might retreat into the darkness to survive, she thought, but life itself always pursues the light. Cerberus was bewildered when Charles came closer. It couldn't believe that a mere level 4 human thought that he could remove a curse created by the Lord of the Underworld.
It's like an ant trying to shake a tree, it mused.
But the beast also knew that people learned by doing. Perhaps this human would learn his lesson after failing. The beast decided to give Charles a chance for the sake of the loyalty mark. When it saw Charles examining its master's mark so seriously, it almost laughed.
Can you even understand such a curse?
It asked. The Hellhound wasn't trying to be dismissive, but it couldn't understand how a human thought they were equal to the Lord of the Underworld. It thought that it had been relatively considerate toward Charles, considering his obvious hubris. Charles was under no illusion that he would be able to shift the curse. His only thought was to give it a try. He decided he had nothing to lose. If he succeeded, it would reduce the suffering of the Cerberus pack. And if he didn't, nothing would change. He quickly discovered the Lord of the Underworld's personal seal on the beast's side. When he saw it, he realized Cerberus had been right. The curse was complicated, and he couldn't see how to undo it. The level of the curse was too high. Charles supposed that was only fitting, considering the caster had been the Lord of the Underworld, an entity that even evoked reverie from kings and queens. But Charles knew that he didn't need to understand the curse. Instead, he used the perception of his soul energy. He sensed that there were 3 different powers within Cerberus's body. One was a flame that seemed to be able to incinerate everything. That was the power of the Cerberus pack itself. However, there was a second power that seemed to be twisted around the first, like a weed strangling a vine. If that first one is the Hellhound's power, Charles muttered, then this one must be the curse. Aside from the bloodline power and the curse, there was also a third power that felt familiar. It seemed to emanate from the same source as Charles's energy storage space. I see what's happening, Charles thought. The curse of the Lord of the Underworld is continuous, and it's entangled with the Hellhound's bloodline power. The Master tried to dampen the curse with his seal. When he disappeared, the power in the seal lost some of its core energy, and the curse spread again. This is good. I just need to infuse some of my power into the Master's seal to restore it. With that thought in his mind, Charles focused on the power of his energy storage space and poured it into the seal. When he did, the marks of decay on the Hellhound's body began to fade. Cerberus was baffled. It had been prepared to mock Charles, but it soon felt the powerful force within its body lifting considerably. The visible signs of the curse began to disappear. The degrading left side of its head was restored to its normal state, and it even grew a tuft of golden fur.
This is our master's power,
the Hellhound cried. Tears leaked simultaneously from its 6 eyes. It could feel its master's familiar strength resealing the curse. The Hellhound let out a loud, victorious howl. The sound was closer to a mutated wolf than a dog. It felt the urge to run, but then an invisible suppression descended over its body. It was unable to move, but that didn't affect its excitement in the slightest.
You are the Master's successor,
it said to Charles.
This is the Master's power. According to the agreement, since you can suppress the power of the curse, we are under your control.
Charles's face was slightly pale from the effort, and he decided to tell the truth. I didn't reseal the curse using my own power, he admitted. I used the existing one. I only used my own power to reactivate your master's work, but my power is too weak to do much more.
That's enough,
the beast assured him.
I haven't felt this much hope in a long time.
Cerberus was immensely satisfied by the result. After a long period of darkness, the Hellhounds could finally welcome the dawn. It knew, though, that some of its kin may not share its enthusiasm. After 1,000 years, many of them had given up hope. The Cerberus pack had been weakening for a long time. They were afraid that one day, their pack would no longer have the strength to protect themselves. They weren't afraid of death, but what they feared the most was losing the chance to regain their lost glory. Regaining it was something they were willing to die for. Charles didn't understand the feeling, but he could tell when he had reactivated the seal. Cerberus had formed a special connection with him. If you want me to help your pack regain its full power, you have to wait until I can remove the curse entirely, he said. His previous annoyance for the creature had vanished. He could sense that his power had only recovered a small portion of the beast's strength, but it was also the strength of a level 7. Once again, he longed to know what would happen if the Hellhound regained its full strength. Charles couldn't help but feel grateful to the entity that had left him his inheritance. He also suddenly understood why, in his previous life, he had never successfully summoned a Hellhound. He was only a level 4 paranormal, so summoning a level 6 or even a level 7 creature was only possible in the vicinity of a gate of hell. His energy storage space in this life was also different from that of his previous life. There, he had only understood the power of death. In this life, however, he also acknowledged the power of life. He suspected that was what had caused the energy within his storage space to change. If he hadn't awakened that energy, he wouldn't have been able to restore the Master's Seal and lift a portion of the Hellhound's curse.
This world hasn't undergone enough change for me to stay, young master,
The Hellhound said.
It's still unable to contain my power.
A small imprint formed on Charles's arm, and a drop of crystallized golden blood glistened from within the mark.
I can't come back to this world for a long time,
Cerberus said.
This is the loyalty mark of the Cerberus Pack. You can use it to summon others just like me, and then use this drop of blood to command them. They can help you recover your strength.
The thick fog wrapped itself around the Hellhound once again, and dragged it back to hell. Once the creature had gone, everyone felt as though they could breathe again. Calvin patted Charles's shoulder. "If you call that thing up here too often, we'll all suffocate," he said. Although it was a joke, the others privately felt the same. The beast's most recent appearance had been different from the last time Charles had summoned it. This time, the Hellhound's presence had seemed to have an additional physical pressure that had almost prevented people near it from being able to breathe. Once Miranda had recovered a little, she looked at Charles in disbelief. "You won its loyalty just like that?" she asked. Charles nodded. "It still calls me young master, though," he said. "I guess I'll get a promotion once I manage to seal the rest of the curse." His heart was full of anticipation. He wanted very much to see the beast restored to its full glory, and he shivered at the thought of how powerful it would be. He had completely changed his mind about the Hellhounds, and he now understood exactly why they had been favored by the powerful entity that had left Charles's inheritance. He thought it was a pity that Earth hadn't been modified by the apocalyptic forces enough to fully sustain the Hellhound's power. It meant that he could only summon the creature to use as his trump card. He examined the Hellhound's mark on his arm. It was the mark of the Cerberus Pack, which was considered a royal bloodline among the Hellhounds. According to Cerberus, Charles could use the loyalty mark to summon other Hellhounds to serve him. Since it contained the blood of the Alpha Hound, it could be used to control the other members of the pack. The Cerberus Pack was known for its loyalty, and Charles had no doubt about their pedigree. Considering their place within the hierarchy of Hell, Charles considered Cerberus's loyalty mark the equivalent of a knighthood. There was also a branch of Hellhounds known as Shepherd Dogs. Its members were often trained by powerful entities to guard their territories. Charles decided if he ever managed to own a territory in Hell, he would like to acquire a shepherd dog for that purpose. Of course, he knew that if he ever wanted a chance to obtain that land, he would need to possess far greater strength than he currently had. "I need to get to level 5, he said quietly to himself. He looked at the ground, which was covered with zombie corpses, and clenched his fists in determination. Once the battle outside the city wall ended, the members of the Dawn Alliance were shocked to see the others alive. They had thought the mission was suicide. There had been more than 10,000 zombies outside the city. The zombies had also been powerful, and the only thing the Alliance had on their side was Charles's strength. They knew that even he couldn't take care of that many creatures alone. No one had known whether he would make it back alive. When Cerberus had appeared, the people guarding the city wall had been stunned, and they had wondered what the monster was and why it had arrived on the battlefield. Even though they had thought they had no chance to win the battle, the beast's appearance had still offered them a brief glimmer of hope. Those who hadn't realized the Hellhound was Charles's ally were so frightened that they had wanted to abandon the city and leave. "Don't worry, it's with us," Olivia had assured them. She had calmly judged the situation on the battlefield. She had felt that the Hellhound's targets were the zombies, and that the beast had no intention to cause any harm to either Charles or the people in the city. Until Cerberus had left, no one dared to take half a step away from the city wall. An hour later, Charles broadcast an order through the number plate on Olivia's waist. "You can leave the city and harvest the bodies."
"We will,"
Olivia agreed. She turned to the deputy chiefs.
"Charles ordered us to leave the city and kill the zombies," she said. "He managed to use his strength to turn the tide of the battle. Our orders are to pick up the corpses. All the profits must be handed over. No one is allowed to hide anything. Those who disobey me will die."
"We won't keep anything," Robert assured her. Charles's unequal power was well known to everyone. No one in the city would ever dare to disobey a direct order. They knew that losing their lives for the sake of a cadaver wasn't worth it. Olivia could see they were all tense, and when she spoke again, it was with a much softer tone.
"All right," she said. "Charles has never mistreated anyone. Even if we're expected to hand over all the profits so that he can distribute them, he isn't going to let any of us starve. The Alliance is everything it is because of the things he has done. I'm not about to beg everyone to be grateful and loyal to him, but I think we all need to think about where you would go and whether you would find someone in this world even half as safe as the Dawn Alliance."
Her words made many of them think. The few deputy chiefs who were present were ambitious people by nature. Charles had known the dangers of entrusting ambitious people at the time of their appointment, and he had discounted the risk. As far as he was concerned, ambition and proactive advancement went hand in hand. He would rather have a handful of ambitious people than 100 lazy ones. The other advantage he saw was that when they gained power, they would work hard to manage their own forces. When it came to betrayal, Charles was almost completely unconcerned. He was so much stronger than anyone else that he had no worries about people betraying him. He had advanced to the point where having loyal subordinates was a bonus and not a necessity. The battle in the storm had lasted for 5 hours. Of that, only 1 hour had been spent on the actual battle, and the remaining time had been dedicated to harvesting the bodies. Once the final harvest was completed, Charles had more than 13,000 crystal cores. No one dared to get greedy, and those who looked remotely suspicious were dealt with by their superiors. Among the crystal cores, the strongest were undoubtedly the level 5 monster cores and the Puppet Master core. The tentacular cadaver cores alone were enough to raise Charles' strength to the peak of level 4. He wasn't in a hurry to break through to level 5. Instead, he began to estimate his gains. The Hellfire could continue burning even in an environment as hostile as the rainstorm. In order to reduce the contamination of the zombie virus, Charles decided to set aside 1,000 crystal cores to help the light and fire element paranormals recover their strength. That way they would have enough energy to complete the cremation work before dark. The parts of the zombies that couldn't be cremated, including the spines and teeth, were collected. Once Charles had categorized everything, he selected a few vertebrae and half of the crystal cores. He handed the rest to Olivia and allowed her and a few of the deputy chiefs to distribute them. Now that everyone had familiarized themselves with their abilities, Charles wasn't required to forge as many simple weapons as he had in the past. He was pleased about that, because it meant that he could focus on forging the best weapons possible. There was only one thing that he hadn't anticipated. "When did our team lose 26 people?" he asked. His face flushed with anger. "I thought most of the powerful zombies were taken out before the rest of you joined. Why were there so many casualties?" When they'd faced the tentacular cadavers and the Puppet Master, they had lost fewer than 10 people. He didn't understand how, after 1/3 of the zombies had already been taken out, the Alliance's body count could be so high. The number made him angry. "It's because we all saw the Hellhound," Harper explained. "When some of the soldiers saw it, they panicked. Some of them who hadn't been afraid when they were faced with zombies couldn't even hold their blades steady once they saw that monster." Charles rubbed his temples in irritation. He was annoyed that he had once again misjudged people. He thought that the apocalypse had been around long enough that people's mental resilience had begun to improve. But it seemed that some of the Alliance members still couldn't accept unnatural occurrences without breaking down. He knew that everyone had a limit to what they could bear, and in the end, his requirements for some had been too high. But he couldn't be annoyed for long. He needed to fill his city with people who had a high tolerance for change. Otherwise, he would lose people every day. "Give them 3 days to get used to their new lives," he instructed. "If they're willing to continue fighting alongside me, then they can continue. If they aren't..." Charles hesitated. He knew that he wasn't living his previous life. If he abandoned everyone who couldn't keep up with him, he might end up with no one. He wanted people who would follow him to war. If he threw people out for nothing, they would quickly lose support. No one would follow such a heartless person. Even though he wanted them to leave, he had to have a reasonable excuse. Then Lena said, "I want to establish a security team to protect the city." Charles looked at his sister in surprise. "Why do you want to make a security team to protect the city all of a sudden?" he asked. He would give his sister anything she requested within reason, but if this was some rash decision, he had the obligation to make her see sense. Lena looked him straight in the eye. "The Dawn Alliance is getting bigger by the day, and it'll only keep growing. But some members are desperate and aren't thinking clearly. They need someone to maintain order and oversee the patrol and defense work." Her explanation was reasonable, and Charles really did need such a team. But he wondered why it had to be his sister, of all people, who led them. They were living in a time without law and order, and he knew that whoever led the security team would be targeted by anyone who benefited from rampant crime. If he put his sister in a position of power, he would also be placing her life in danger. Lena continued, "If you don't let me do this, then I'll leave the base to hunt zombies. I can't just sit here and do nothing like a carefree, spoiled princess." He saw the determination in her eyes and knew she wouldn't give up. He nodded solemnly. "Okay, but you have to be careful and use all the defensive measures I prepared for you." She smiled widely. "Okay," she said eagerly. "I'll be sure to do that." Her smile made his heart stutter. "But if you take on this responsibility," he said, "you have to do your job well. You can't let your feelings influence your decisions, and if you can't do that, then there will be consequences, even though you're my sister." His tone grew serious. "Don't forget that times have changed. You have to adapt to the new rules and morals. And because you're my sister, I'll ask more of you than I do of others." If she wasn't in a position of power, Charles could let her continue to be carefree. But if she took on this role, it had to be with the utmost caution. He knew how power could change a person, usually in a negative way, and he wanted to protect his sister as much as possible. He wasn't worried that Lena would use her new power for personal gain. Rather, he was concerned that she would be too fair. "I understand," Lena said. "I'll learn from Olivia." "Speaking of the Dawn Alliance growing," Olivia said, "there's one more thing we wanted to ask your opinion about, Charles." "What is it?" he asked. There were very few things Olivia couldn't decide on her own, so he knew this matter was very important for her to have to ask him about it. Her face was solemn as she said, "We want to change the Dawn Alliance's name to Dawn City." Everyone fell into complete silence. Whether they called themselves the Dawn Alliance or Dawn City might seem to outsiders to be just a slight name change that wouldn't make much difference. But everyone present understood that such a change would actually be very significant. The Dawn Alliance was an organization formed out of necessity. They had joined forces for survival, and because they had common interests. But if they changed their name to Dawn City, it meant they were establishing a more permanent, more structured entity. It wasn't as if they would immediately declare war on the rest of the country. But once they changed their name to Dawn City, they would become an independent force and would be both a threat and a target. Charles's gaze swept across the deputy chiefs, and a mocking smile appeared on his lips. "You all seem to be looking forward to making me a lord or a king or something." "No, that's not what we meant," Taylor hurriedly explained. He could tell by Charles's expression and tone that he was upset by this idea, although he didn't know why. "All right, since you all want it, I'll agree." Charles waved his hand. "From now on, this place will be called Dawn City. I'll be the mayor, and Olivia will be the deputy mayor. The rest of you can be counselors. Each of you will be in charge of one gate, while Kevin will be the captain of the guards for the mayor's residence. Lena will be the captain of the city guards, and our citizens will be called Dawnians. Any objections?" "It's up to you to decide," Jason said. Everyone else was quick to agree with that sentiment, but they squirmed in discomfort. They could tell that Charles was still unhappy with the idea, so it seemed odd to them that he had actually agreed and had assigned duties to everyone so quickly. This didn't make much sense to them, because Charles had the most to gain by declaring the Alliance a city. In the original Dawn Alliance, he had been the leader in name, but it had still been a democracy. If the Dawn Alliance changed its name to Dawn City, then the mayor would have the highest authority, and Charles would have the final word on everything. They would all go from his equals to his subordinates, and he had no reason to be dissatisfied with that. What made them even more curious was that he had agreed after he had appeared so dissatisfied with the suggestion. They knew Charles's character. If he was unwilling to do something, even if everyone else wanted it, he would simply stand his ground, and they would always end up agreeing with whatever decision he made, as long as he insisted. He had the most power and the greatest support from the people, so the group of leaders knew that if he was submitting to their pressure, then there must have been a good reason. They weren't strong enough to defy Charles, and they had no intentions of twisting his arm. They were only thinking about the good of the Alliance. Kevin saw Charles's reluctance, so he asked, "Is there a problem with our suggestion? Or is there some kind of hidden danger?" Charles shook his head. "No, there's no problem. Change the name to Dawn City. It'll legitimize us and make the people feel united." "All right," Kevin said, sensing that he wouldn't get any further explanation. Olivia was a bit perplexed too, but she knew now wasn't the time to ask Charles about it. "We're all citizens of Dawn City now. Dawnians," she said. "Congratulations, Mayor Federer, for becoming the leader of the biggest survival base in the world." Once the meeting ended, Miranda approached Charles. She knew he was acting out of character and wondered why he had tolerated their request. "Charles, I can tell that you're very angry," she said. "Is changing the Alliance's name dangerous somehow?" "I won't lie to you," he replied. "It's more detrimental than it is beneficial." Naming a survival base as a city in the middle of the apocalypse reflected strength, which could only help their image. It gave the people a greater sense of security, too. An alliance was only a group of people with common interests. It was a fragile thing that could be dissolved at any time. But calling it a city naturally gave people the illusion that this was a place where they could truly live in peace. A place that could be their home for a long time. A place worth risking their lives to protect. That was why Charles had agreed to their proposition. Miranda frowned. "Then why are you doing this? Is it because you suspect they want to betray us?" "I'm angry that they even had the gall to ask." Anger flashed in his eyes. "What authority do they have to do this? The Dawn Alliance has only just begun. If they change the name of the Alliance to a city so soon, then the Dawn Alliance's power will increase tenfold. Do they really want to give me so much power?" Only then did Miranda understand. Charles did want to change the name. He knew it had to be done. But there were only a few tens of thousands of people in the Dawn Alliance at that moment, and he felt it was too soon to give that much power to a handful of people. Miranda was also very familiar with the concept of mutiny. Perhaps all the newly titled counselors would remain loyal and would only do what their mayor asked of them. But she felt it was suspicious how they had forced him into a position he shouldn't have had to be in just yet. "I know what you're thinking," Charles said. He gave her a meaningful look. "It never ends well for anyone who comes into sudden power like this. What happens if I say no the next time they want me to do something?" A chill shot down her spine. She knew these people. They no longer had any thoughts of rebelling, but by pushing Charles into the position of highest authority, they had also expanded their own power and influence. And if he refused to take up the position, it wouldn't stay vacant for long. It was human nature to chase after power. "Then what should we do?" Miranda asked. Charles sighed. "Don't worry about it. Things like this have a way of working themselves out. Given enough time, any problems will be exposed and dealt with, even if they get worse first. Time is all we need." But he was still troubled as he thought about how he would deal with the other leaders if it came to that. He thought that perhaps he was worrying for nothing, and their motives were sincere. But it was his duty to consider every possibility, and he couldn't let them get away with any nefarious plans. Once the zombie horde was cleared, Charles spent the next 2 days distributing crystal cores and counting those who were still willing to follow him into battle. Many of them were already questioning their courage. Although there were many benefits to following Charles, it was also very dangerous. Fortunately, Lena had already established her city guard, which had a positive impact on everyone's mood. If a person felt useless, they wouldn't want to follow Charles anymore and would be afraid of being left to their own devices. But those who had lost the courage to fight in battle were assigned a position in the city guard. This gave them a purpose and made everyone feel more at ease, including those who were willing to follow Charles into battle. Although there were only 114 people left from Charles's original group, a lot of new people had joined, and he had a few hundred people still willing to fight alongside him. Everyone was afraid of death, but many people were willing to risk their lives if it benefited them in some way. This was especially true for those who hadn't awakened yet. they had to rely on themselves for every step of their cultivation, so if someone was willing to guide them, they would be happy to follow instructions. Charles was gratified that his 12 best fighters had chosen to stay, and even Mark, who had been born with divine power, was also willing to follow him. After handing this matter over to Hugh and the others, Charles focused on his breakthrough plan. His recent harvest had been plentiful. Even though they had mostly scavenged level 4 crystal cores after the battle, he had obtained dozens of them. His supply was more than enough for him to break through to level 5. It was a very important step. Once a paranormal reached level 5, they could turn their elemental energy into dragons. Even the bio-altered types could turn their energy into dragon energy. For any paranormal, no matter what type, reaching level 5 was like breaking through a barrier into a realm of life known as the Dragon Realm. Passing into this realm was a significant advancement. There wasn't a huge difference between level 4 and level 5, but after reaching level 5, a paranormal strength started growing much more rapidly. Level 4 was like high school. No matter how well a person performed, they still only gained high school level knowledge. Reaching level 5 was like going to university. The fundamentals were the same, but the curriculum was much more rigorous. There were some who were quite powerful at only level 4, but there were others who didn't study hard enough to truly grasp the concepts. To those people, reaching level 5 was useless. It was only another thing to brag about. To Charles, reaching level 5 would mean that he could condense divine seeds. He would reach saint level too. According to the nameless ancient book he had studied, level 5s gained a divine ability and could choose a superpower to use ahead of time. Charles thought that the best idea was to choose a superpower that would enhance his body. In his previous life, he had chosen the Terminator sword ability, the most suitable superpower for his temperament. It had increased his ability to kill decisively, and it made him a formidable warrior. But in this life, that divine ability wasn't enough for him. To increase his combat strength, he needed to focus on offense, defense, and speed. He already had innate sword energy, so the Terminator's sword ability was no longer the best choice for him. He needed to choose a divine ability that maximized his advantages. In his mind, Charles sorted through what he had learned. He very rarely had to use complicated tactics, because there were thousands of tactics in the ancient book. Every extract amulet had been researched to the extreme and was very powerful. All he really needed to study now was a few core abilities. In his previous life, some people had specialized in a single area and had honed a particular killing technique. They had been so focused that their power had surpassed the limit. But in the end, all of them had died. The path they had chosen hadn't been wrong. It was easiest to excel at something by focusing solely on that area. None of these people had been wrong to do so, but they had been in the wrong environment for it. Life was in constant crisis during this apocalypse. People had to fight zombies, wild beasts, mutated bugs, and invading enemies from other worlds. Resources were scarce, and they had to search in the wild and kill each other for them. They also had to worry about sneak attacks from their own allies. In the face of all these dangers, it was no wonder that honing one area wasn't enough. And anyone who thought that it was seemed to have their head in the clouds. Maybe practicing one technique to the extreme really would be enough someday, but in the harsh environment of the apocalypse, those who specialized wouldn't likely survive. Trying to learn everything also wasn't worth it though, as there wasn't nearly enough time to do so whilst trying to survive. So the best way to learn, Charles decided, was to concentrate on his strengths and make up for his weaknesses with the help of his teammates or by other means. He couldn't focus only on improving his killing techniques. He also had to put a lot of energy into learning defensive strategies so he could stay alive. After all, only those who survived could even consider the future. Next, Charles started to organize what he had learned. He knew how to draw on the power of the extract amulets. They could be stored in the void and accessed whenever he needed them. He had also learned a bit about medical treatment. He knew he wouldn't have made a very good leader if he didn't know how to treat wounds, although he did occasionally rely on a revival amulet to do so. On top of that, he already had a great deal of experience at refining weapons. Many of the paranormals in Dawn City had mastered their own strength and could already control their elements enough to forge ordinary weapons. Charles just needed to help them improve the quality. He decided he didn't need to study most methods of weapon refining too seriously. But there was one method that did require more serious study, and that was the creation of blood refining weapons, which only grew stronger the more blood they shed. He noted that he would have to spend more time learning how to better craft such weapons. Everyone had an energy limit, and Charles was no exception. He couldn't spend too much energy chasing unorthodox paths when increasing his strength was his main goal. But blood-refining weapons were one method he could use to increase his strength, so they were worthy of his research. He thought about combat techniques next. As far as attacking went, he had the Sword of Death to take lives, and his innate sword energy to cut through everything. Neither one of these had a limit, so the more his physical strength and endurance increased, the more powerful these techniques would become. He decided the first thing he should strengthen was his physique, to stretch his body's physical limits. Only then would he be able to increase his attack power to the greatest extent. Of course, he thought it would be best if he worked on defense, speed, recovery ability, flexibility, and agility, besides just his overall strength. I seem to be getting a bit greedy, Charles thought, laughing at himself. Trying to be proficient in everything would only make him mediocre. If he wanted to excel at everything, then even he might fail the ultimate test. But he valued his offensive ability the most. The path he walked demanded strength. What he desired most was to destroy all his enemies and protect his people. To that end, when he got the Divine Seed, the first thing he would focus on was his physique, so he could maximize his attack power. Wait a minute, he thought. Why do I need to increase my body's strength and endurance? My innate sword energy can increase infinitely and can exceed my body's limits. And I can always use the Extract Amulet too. I just need something that'll let me safely unleash a strength that surpasses my typical limit. He realized that since he had the innate sword energy, he didn't need a divine ability that increased his body's limits. Instead, he needed a divine ability that could preserve his life and even maintain a certain level of combat strength after he unleashed a power far greater than his body could withstand. Although the innate sword energy and the Sword of Death were both very powerful, if he faced an agile opponent, he would be severely injured if he was unable to hit them. So he realized his chosen divine ability should give him speed, agility, and the ability to recover. Suddenly, he knew exactly which divine ability to choose: the Preservation ability. It was a support-type divine ability that greatly increased one's speed, agility, senses, and reaction time. It was the perfect divine ability for someone who wanted to be an expert in agility. Originally, Charles hadn't even considered choosing this divine ability because it could only be used to escape and wouldn't greatly increase his attack or defensive abilities. It also wouldn't boost his combat strength much. He had thought he would choose a divine ability that could maximize both his offense and his defense, but he recognized there was no such thing as the most powerful divine ability, only the most suitable one. Charles firmly believed in the power of his innate sword energy and the Sword of Death. But if he encountered an opponent whose strength far surpassed his own, it would be absolutely essential to have a certain degree of agility to fight them. Although the Preservation ability wouldn't help his defense much, it would allow him to endure the release of a great deal of soul energy. That meant that if he used the Preservation ability while activating the innate sword energy, he would be able to unleash even greater power. At that moment, Charles's only weakness was his defensive skills. At first, he could still use Blue Flame Energy Gems to make soft armor, and Crimson Flame Energy Gems for the rest. Eventually, he would be able to cultivate even more divine abilities to further bolster his defense. But for now, the Preservation ability was the most suitable divine ability for him. After finalizing his decision, Charles planned to announce to everyone that he was going to isolate himself for a few days. But before he could, Greg found him. 3 days ago, we came across a monster, he said. It's already killed hundreds of people. It disappeared underground during the heavy rain, but now it's back. I've come to ask you to kill it for us. We're willing to pay you generously. Charles raised his eyebrows. Can't the military take care of it? Our best soldiers have gone to Butte and the nearby cities to fight the zombies, Greg explained. Most of the rest of them have gone to save the survivors. There aren't enough of us left to handle this monster. Don't worry about the money, Charles said. I won't take it because you've protected us from this monster as well. Just let me be the one to kill it, and that'll be reward enough for me. Now tell me everything you know about this monster. Charles had agreed to help the military deal with the monster primarily to express his gratitude. Not only did the military protect the entire country constantly, but most of the people who now lived in Dawn City had been in a fortress protected by the military at one point or another before they had arrived there. That was also why he couldn't accept any sort of payment. He was the mayor of Dawn City now, and he had to take care of the entire city. Any amount of power always came with an equal amount of obligation. Since he had authority over these people, he was also responsible for them. Of course, there were always some people in power who forced the weak to work for their benefit. That sort of situation never lasted long, though. Charles had another consideration as well. As his power grew, others would only grow more wary of him. Building a good relationship with the military now would save him a lot of trouble later. It was irrational for anyone to pick a fight with someone who had the military on their side. When Charles agreed to help, Greg said excitedly, "Thank you so much." Charles didn't want to join forces with the military, but he had never shown them too much hostility either, and this arrangement was mutually beneficial. He couldn't turn down an opportunity like this. After discussing the next day's departure with Greg, Charles called Tina, Hugh, and Tommy over. They didn't understand why at first. When they saw 2 cups of tea emitting an unpleasant smell, their eyes widened in excitement. They knew Charles could help others awaken, and they recognized the same serum that Charles had used to help Elena awaken swirling within it. Tommy was still doing fine. He had already awakened and was familiarizing himself with his new power, but Hugh and Tina had nearly lost their composure. Charles was more confident than usual when he was helping people awaken. He passed the cups of tea to Tina and Hugh. "I've promised each of you that I will let you become a paranormal," he said. "Now that you've honed your willpower, it's time for you to get your superpowers." "Thank you," they both exclaimed. They immediately drank the tea. As soon as they had finished gulping it down, intense pain spread throughout their bodies. They clenched their teeth and fell to the ground, writhing in agony. But they had followed Charles for a long time, and he had specially trained them to endure the pain. Charles had determined that their willpower had reached a sufficient level, and that was the only reason he was willing to help them awaken. After all, it was very tiring to help others awaken, and he could be using this time to increase his own strength and recruit more paranormals. But these 3 people had worked hard, and Charles recognized that. While the other 2 thrashed around in pain, Charles gave Tommy a scrutinizing look. "Have you been neglecting your martial arts practice recently?" Tommy hesitated before saying, "I just got my superpower, so I've been spending more time familiarizing myself with it." "Every innate paranormal gains a lot of knowledge about their superpower when they awaken," Charles said. "They even have information about the other world and can control several superpowers. This advantage can't be made up for by acquiring superpowers like you have." It wasn't fair, but the world had never been fair. Since nothing could be done about that, people could only try their best to change the world in their favor. A cloud seemed to come over Tommy's features. "Then will we always be trying to catch up to them?" he asked. He was somewhat discouraged. Like most people, he dreamed of being outstanding. He wanted to continuously increase his strength and keep climbing the ladder. He had spent the past few days exercising his superpower, hoping to catch up with those who had innate superpowers. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never achieve the same level. It had been a naive fantasy. He had thought that as long as he worked hard enough, he would have the possibility of being their equal. But Charles had just crushed that fantasy. Tommy understood that he could rely on resources and hard work to catch up to some people who didn't work hard. But everyone still alive was already working hard. "Not necessarily," Charles finally answered, glancing at Tina and Hugh. "Think of it this way. Although weightlifters are strong, they're not as good at fighting as professional boxers are." Tommy understood what Charles meant. "Are you saying I can use other skill to make up for it?" he asked. If strength was everything, then theoretically speaking, a weightlifter could defeat a boxer. But in an actual fight, strength was an important factor, but it wasn't everything. Speed and skill were equally important. Charles was just reminding him that in terms of strength, he wasn't as good as the innate paranormals. But he was also telling him that he shouldn't compare his weaknesses to their strengths. Suddenly, a white light appeared on Tina's hand. It was the symbol of the bio-altered type. Although acquired superpower possessors could also solidify their soul energy, they were still not as skilled at it as the innate paranormals. "If this is what you want, I'll do it," Tina said to Charles. Her voice was weak, but there was no doubt in her words. She knew that Charles's knowledge far surpassed ordinary paranormals, so the path he arranged would be the most suitable path for her. If she had wanted autonomy, she could have left Charles, but he was the reason she had survived and now possessed everything she did. She didn't care about making her own decisions. Even if he let her go, she didn't think she could ever leave. "He must have invested so much energy into us. We won't waste it," Hugh said, looking serious. The 3 of them knew they didn't have any talent. Charles was the one who had given them their status and power. They wanted to repay his kindness, because they wouldn't have had anything if it hadn't been for him. Charles nodded in satisfaction. Since the three of them knew what to do, it wouldn't be a waste of his energy. The corner of his mouth lifted in a smile as he said, "Now decide what kind of weapon you want and I'll forge it for you." Tina and Hugh both chose swords, while Tommy chose a spear. After each of them had given him a rough design of what they wanted, Charles used a Crimson Flame energy gem to forge the weapons so they could start familiarizing themselves with them. They looked at their brand new weapons in admiration and couldn't wait to try them out. But once the three of them left, Charles narrowed his eyes and muttered to himself, "I gave you all your strength and status, so it's only fair that I put some stipulations on the weapons. If you remain loyal, then these weapons will be the most dependable things in your lives. But if you betray me, then you better watch out." The weapons he had forged for them were blood-refining weapons, each made from a bone spur from a zombie corpse. The weapons were a combination of killing intent, blood energy, and resentment. They were like living things that could grow by killing enemies and absorbing their blood energy. Because Charles had forged them, his ability to absorb blood energy had also greatly improved. The weapons' special ability to absorb evil energy meant that the more blood they shed, the stronger they became. But unlike the blood-drinking sword, this sinister energy didn't make the weapons physically stronger. It only made them more powerful in battle. But this power came at a price. If Tina, Hugh, and Tommy remained loyal, their weapons would last for a very long time. Even if they began to wear down in the future, Charles would help them refine the weapons again. But if they betrayed him, then Charles would release the deadly energy that was bound up in the weapons, and it would backfire, causing their blood to flow in reverse and kill them. Such a form of revenge might have sounded wicked to some, but it would be their own fault if that happened. It didn't matter whether he told them about this built-in condition. If they wanted to maintain their status, they would remain obedient to Charles in any case. Without him, they would have been zombie food from the beginning. He had no regrets about his actions. The next day, Charles left Dawn City with Tina, Hugh, and Tommy to hunt down the Deathwater monster. Even though Dawn City had just experienced a major crisis, its reputation had spread far and wide. Many people were all the more eager to join precisely because it was a time of crisis, and they brought their friends and family with them. The population had increased exponentially, already exceeding 100,000 people. Many of the newcomers spoke of Charles as if he were a god, and the Dawnians frantically worked to make proper arrangements for them. Miranda led Anthony and the others to bring the people they had saved to the city, and save some more people along the way. Although they were reluctant to risk their lives along with Miranda, they didn't betray their duty or defect and join another force. Moral standards had shifted, and choosing to remain loyal was seen as more virtuous than risking their lives. Now that Lena was the captain of the city guards, she'd spent the past 2 days maintaining the security of Dawn City. But she took a hands-off approach to how she dealt with people who caused trouble. She constantly studied Olivia's rules and thought deeply about the intentions of those rules. Other than executing a few scumbags who had abused women, she didn't interfere in most of the fights. Charles was pleased with his sister's change in attitude. If she had tried to fight for justice in every unfair situation, he didn't think she could stay in her position for long. Meanwhile, with the help of a lot of high-grade crystal cores, Elena reached level 4, and Sylvia reached the peak of level 4, but didn't break through. Jenny still hadn't woken up, so Charles asked them to keep guarding her. On Miranda's team, Dale had unexpectedly broken through, which the Dawnians were very excited about because it meant their overall protective power had increased. Miranda's team had become a force to be reckoned with. Of course, from the outside looking in, Miranda's team was still under Olivia's. Outside the base, Charles, Tina, Hugh, and Tommy hunted zombies on their way to find the Deathwater monster. Charles had called it a form of training. Since he was there, they had nothing to worry about, so the three of them were at ease. After Hugh killed a zombie, he skillfully took the crystal core out of its body and put it into his backpack. Tina took out a map and looked at the road. According to what Greg said, the Deathwater monster should be straight ahead. Tommy frowned and asked Charles, "Does the Deathwater monster really exist? How terrifying is this thing anyway?" Charles was quiet for a moment. "Yes, it exists. In the old days, the Deathwater monster was just another creature. But now many creatures have mutated, and I'm not sure in what ways this one is mutated." There were 3 types of creatures visible to the naked eye: plants, animals, and fungi. But the Deathwater monster had become something that didn't exactly fit into any of these categories. Although it sounded very powerful, it was really just another type of creature. "Then why did you agree to fight it?" Tina asked. This is a terrifying monster that has already killed hundreds of people, and if it hadn't been for the rain, it would have killed even more. Most of the people who had attacked Stellar Technologies' base were confident in their own strength and could cause a lot of damage. But according to the information they had been given, this potentially ancient monster wasn't afraid of superpowered attacks, physical damage, or fire. It didn't seem to have any weaknesses. Charles said, "There's no such thing as a monster that can't be hurt. The attacks against it so far just haven't caused enough damage. It doesn't matter how strong the Deathwater monster is. If we use true fire non-stop, it has to die eventually. Even without the military or Lewis here to back us up, the Deathwater monster should be very afraid of us." Charles had seen many terrifying monsters in his previous life. Many of them had been mysterious and terrifying, but only because people hadn't properly understood them. With enough knowledge, humans could eliminate any threat a monster posed. There were two reasons Charles had agreed to help the military get rid of the threat. First was because he wanted the military to owe him a favor, and second was that getting rid of the monster also benefited him. When he and the others arrived at the abandoned Stellar Technology base where the monster had first been seen, there were already many people there. "Do these people have a death wish?" Tommy asked with a frown. "This monster's caused hundreds of casualties. Why would anyone stick around?" "Maybe they think that the more dangerous it is, the more likely there's something worth having in there," Charles said. "I'd be lying if I said I've never put myself into a dangerous situation because I thought the potential reward outweighed the risk." Charles recalled the old days when people had gone out to sea to salvage sunken ships, or when others had dug deep into the mountains to search for treasure. Many of them had disappeared and were never seen or heard from again. But no matter how many deaths or disappearances there were, it never seemed to deter more people from trying. Although it had sometimes seemed as though they were all suicidal, their trepidatious nature was the same force that had always compelled humans to pursue things that would make them stronger. Charles arrived at the ruins of Stellar Technology. He went inside and noticed a large hole in the ground. It descended all the way to the basement, which was the monster's first known location. There was a large crowd assembled in the foyer, and they were immediately curious when Charles and his team appeared. Charles suddenly felt movement under the ground, as if something was rising rapidly. His confusion aroused a wave of ridicule from several people who were standing several feet away from the mouth of the hole. "Oh look, another thief. You guys want to take bets if he can survive? 10-1. I'll take those odds." Clearly, these people had some knowledge about the abandoned base. They had gone there initially to search for anything Stellar Technology had left behind. Although the genetic enhancement drug only had a rough formula, it was hard to obtain. Everything about it, from the production cost to the materials, was expensive. The people who lurked at the abandoned site were searching for any information that they could sell for a good price. But because of the heavy rain 2 days prior, and the destruction from the mob's raid, almost anything of any use had been destroyed. Few people had managed to salvage anything. Amid the chorus of gloating and doubt, an anxious voice rose above the rest. "Don't get too close to the hole." Charles searched for the source of the voice and saw a young woman wearing a jacket. There was a great deal of concern in her eyes. From her vantage point, she could see a thick substance rising from the basement. The viscous liquid was getting closer to Charles. "You need to get out, now," she told him. She shook her head in defeat. She had seen many people die just by touching the Deathwater monster, and she knew that her warning was useless. Just when the crowd thought Charles was going to die, they heard him shout, "Get back!" He conjured a watery blue mist and doused the Deathwater monster. As soon as the mist appeared, the creature returned to the hole. "What do you know?" said Charles. "The Deathwater monster doesn't like water." As soon as Charles had heard how the Deathwater monster had stopped chasing people during the rainstorm, he had been suspicious. To his mind, it made sense that a water-based monster would be affected by the element. As soon as the monster came into contact with water, it retreated into a form of hibernation until the water passed through its body. The reason that attacks initiated by water-powered paranormals didn't have any effect on it was because they only possessed a substance that mimicked the properties of water, and not the actual thing. Charles had turned the water inside an extract amulet into mist, creating a mist amulet. The combination seemed to work against the Deathwater monster. In his previous life, Charles had heard of Deathwater monster, but he had never seen the creature with his own eyes. Several days earlier, when he had heard descriptions of the monster, he had worked out what it was based on his knowledge from the past. The people around the base were speechless. When they had seen the monster rising from the basement, they had assumed they were about to watch a good show, but now they all looked as though they had been slapped across the face. None of them had ever seen someone go up against the Deathwater monster and live to tell the tale. A burly man with a scar on his face strode up to Charles. "Hey," he exclaimed. "How'd you make that thing leave?" Charles didn't like the way the scarred man had approached him, but he was less than impressed by his aggressive tone. "Get out of my way," Charles said with a scowl. His reaction elicited murmurs from the crowd. Some of them laughed nervously. "Did he just tell Brad to get out of the way?" someone said. "He's gonna get a beating." "Okay, bets are back on." There was a small group of people around Brad, and they all seemed to be in some kind of gang together. They had a lot of confidence in Brad because they had seen him take out many people during the previous days. He had a reputation for having a hair-trigger temper. The young woman who had told Charles to be careful shrank back into the larger crowd and didn't dare to get involved. She decided she had done her part to help Charles, and she wasn't about to help him take on the meanest guy in the room. "You think you're tough?" Brad asked Charles threateningly. "I don't care if you can scare some water. No one disrespects me like that. You know what happens to people who talk to me like that? I break their knees until they beg for mercy. Is that what you want, little hero man?" "You can try," Charles replied calmly. Brad's team once again broke out into nervous laughter, and Brad was furious. He hated being belittled in front of his friends. No one ever called his bluff. He threw a filthy look at the other members of his gang, but as soon as his attention was diverted, he felt an intense pain in his knees. Brad cried out in pain, and the alarmed crowd stopped laughing. "You're a sneaky little coward," Brad yelled at Charles. "You have to take advantage of someone who isn't even looking." Charles had waited until Brad had been distracted, but then he had shattered both of his knees. He didn't pay any attention to Brad's cries, and instead picked him up with one hand and threw him into the hole that led to the basement. "I don't care if he's dead or not in there," Charles said to the crowd, "but I don't care for bullies and threats." "Guys, help me!" came a voice from the basement. Brad tried in vain to use his powers to get out of the hole, but he soon realized that he no longer had any control over the soul energy in his body. He was left with no option but to cry for help. Charles, however, wasn't the kind of person who responded to begging. He had made the decision to leave Brad to die, and he wasn't about to go back on his actions. In his experience, the rule of the apocalypse was kill or be killed, and he saw little difference between breaking a knee and killing a man. There was a dreadful wail from the basement below, followed by the sloshing sound of water. The viscous liquid consumed Brad in seconds. When everyone saw how ruthless Charles was, there were no more jibes or pretend bets against him. Everyone was silent. Charles looked at Brad's teammates with a sarcastic smile. "Any of you want to go in after your friend?" he asked. "He's not our friend," one of them said hastily. "We're not with him." Charles didn't care whether or not the other gang members of the base had been friends with Brad. Instead, he looked around the room, walked away from the hole in the ground, and returned to Tina and the others. As Charles walked through the crowd of onlookers, they cowered under his gaze as though he was a wild beast. When they realized he wasn't going to harm them, they all heaved sighs of relief. They were all ashamed of how they had acted toward him, but they knew they couldn't change the past. And if he had decided to take revenge on them, they would have no way of fighting back. A voice rang out from the crowd. "Those gang members were with Brad all along," someone said. "I saw them break a guy's legs with my own eyes and then throw him to some zombies." Once the first person spoke up, the remaining people began to speculate. In their opinion, since Charles had taken out Brad, he ought to do the same with the rest of the gang. "That new guy should kill them all." "Yeah, he killed Brad." "Tell him to kick these guys out." The people in the crowd were full of hope. They had been awed by Charles's demonstration of strength. They had never known anyone to win a fight against Brad, and this stranger had taken him out with one hit. Charles rolled his eyes. He knew he could easily defeat Brad's little gang, but he chose to ignore the crowd's complaints for the time being. "Take out all your crystal cores," he told Tina and the other two, especially the ones at level 3. The three of them did as they were told and handed him their crystal cores. Charles was the one who had given them their strength, so even if he wanted to take it away, they weren't going to show even the slightest bit of resistance. They also knew that he wasn't the kind of person who would take away everything they had worked hard for. If he wanted the crystal cores, he had a plan for them in mind. The crowd began to grow annoyed by Charles's continued silence. Their criticism grew louder.
I thought he was ruthless, but Brad was right. He's just a coward. He isn't even fighting back.
None of them had liked Brad, and they had been pleased when Charles had helped them deal with the threat. But now that he was ignoring their requests for help, and they knew they could taunt him without fear of retribution, they began to turn on him. Tina looked at the surrounding people with disgust in her eyes. "Are they all crazy?" she asked. "Have they all forgotten you just killed a guy? Why would they pick a fight with you?" She spoke her opinion quietly. She knew that the 4 of them were outnumbered. Their small group was no match for the whole crowd. "Don't worry about them," Charles replied with a cold expression on his face. He arranged the crystal cores in a specific pattern. Although the configuration looked messy, there was a reason for the chaos. Charles had created an elaborate spell array that he had learned from his ancient book. It was the life absorption ritual, and it had the power to absorb the energy of powerful creatures and transfer it into the caster's body. The Deathwater monster was powerful, but it had 2 weaknesses. Firstly, it was slow, and secondly, it lacked intelligence. Not all powerful or evolved creatures were intelligent. The Deathwater monster was a new category of species independent from animals, plants, and fungi. Its evolutionary path was different from the creatures on Earth, and because it was an unknown entity, people were afraid of it. But to Charles, it was an exciting potential for his advancement. Still annoyed at being ignored, the remaining onlookers continued to talk about Charles. Brad's thuggish friends were particularly venomous.
Maybe he just got lucky before,
one of them suggested.
"Yeah, he did take out Brad's knees when he wasn't looking,"
another agreed.
"Besides, he seems too afraid to attack us, which means he's not as powerful as he looks."
Charles's refusal to retaliate had given them enough confidence to take action.
"Let's get him,"
one of the gang members said. One of the paranormal bullies raised his hand and shot a fireball at Charles. The group felt more comfortable launching a long-range attack. If Charles intended to fight back, they would have enough time and distance to react. They also judged based on what they knew from the previous battle that he was a close combat fighter. As for the crowd, they looked like they were watching a good show. "Since it seems like you guys have a death wish, your wish is my command," Charles said. He hadn't taken them seriously at first, but since they insisted on provoking him, he knew he had no choice but to engage. He flicked his wrist, and several glass balls appeared. Without warning, he threw them at Brad's companions. They hit the gang members' knees with a loud thud. The thugs cried out in pain and collapsed to the ground. "Bring them over," Charles ordered. Tina and the other 2 brought the thugs to him. At that moment, all the onlookers stopped shouting. They realized that Charles hadn't been ignoring them before. He simply hadn't taken them seriously. But they also felt they were safe in the crowd. If he angered them, it was at least 20 to 1. Meanwhile, Brad's companions begged Charles for mercy. They all had matching panicked expressions on their faces. Charles opened the glass balls and tapped each of the thugs sharply with one. Their soul energy was instantly sealed inside the glass. They sobbed at his feet and knew there was no hope for mercy. "I think a blood sacrifice will make the spell array stronger," Charles muttered to himself. He killed the thugs within moments and added a few drops of blood from each to the spell array. Then he pulled a small knife from his pocket and cut his upper arm, letting a significant amount of his own blood trickle down his arm and off of his fingers onto the formation. Tina and the other 2 were used to Charles's brutal ways. When they thought about it, they had all seen him do much worse. Tina was uncomfortable with how desensitized she had become. But no one in the crowd was familiar with such brutality. Brad's death had been clean and a result of his own bullish personality. The deaths of his friends, however, were nothing short of murder. The onlookers began to protest loudly.
"What is this? Is he doing a sacrificial spell array?
He's going to use it to attack us." As they began to debate what to do, Charles glared at them. They were so scared that they ran out of the base, not daring to stop for a moment. "Look at all of you, upset by a little sacrifice," Charles mocked them. "Get used to the world you live in." He watched the fleeing crowd and shook his head. Then, he continued his work. Charles knew that there would always be stubborn people who refused to change their minds. He had seen many cases over both of his lifetimes where people had been too proud or stubborn to change their ways. Every time he saw someone who refused to hunt or who allowed others to steal their things without fighting back, he knew that person wasn't destined to live for long. The crowd in the foyer of the old Stellar Technology base was comprised of the same kind of people. They had clearly been dissatisfied with Brad and his cronies, but they had refused to join forces to fight them. Instead, they had allowed the gang to wreak havoc. Charles could somewhat understand their thought process because they only had one life. He was sure none of them wanted to die fighting some generic bullies, so he could understand their reluctance. But that was where his sympathy ended. Although he didn't like the crowd, he was similarly disdainful toward the former bullies. He didn't like people who preyed on others just to prove their own power, and he was surprised by how often he ran into that kind of person. There were apparently a lot of them around. They were the kind of people who were unable to resist power, but they had no regard for the weak. If they saw an opportunity to take advantage of someone, they would. If they were given a little bit of power, they would use it to make others bow down to them. It was the worst kind of ambition, and Charles had no time for that kind of behavior. He also knew that the more time went by, the lower the bullies' values would become, and the stronger their propensity to cause trouble would be. It was inevitable that, sooner or later, they would bring disaster upon themselves. When the life absorption ritual sensed the sacrifice Charles had offered, it began to work. The medicinal crystal cores formed a connection with each other until they had created a large hexagram surrounded by small pentagonal stars. As soon as the array began to work, a green light emanated from the hole in the ground, and a number of small green lights surged up from the basement. Charles stood in the middle of the spell array and allowed the light spots to enter his body. The Deathwater monster was a creature with a huge amount of energy. Since the apocalypse had affected the Earth, it had made the creature's energy stronger. On the evolutionary scale, the Deathwater monster's closest related organism was a fungus. Once a large amount of its energy entered Charles's body, he felt his own depleted soul energy begin to return. The monster's energy restored his vitality to its peak, and even began to surpass it. Once he had finished restoring his own soul energy, he began to condense the preservation ability's Divine Seed. Although he wasn't overly familiar with condensing divine seeds, he had a great deal of theoretical knowledge about the process. A large amount of energy began to gather in Charles's heart, and it formed a small dot of light. When the light appeared, it began to rapidly devour Charles's soul energy. Charles had prepared a large number of crystal cores. Once he had refined them, he turned them into a restoring amulet. The benefit of doing that was that he wouldn't need to use up a large amount of soul energy for the ritual, nor would it cause his body to show signs of aging. There was a downside to the process, however. It would have some effect on the Divine Seed's power. But since Charles had a substantial amount of soul energy to use as a foundation, he decided the benefit outweighed the risk. Within moments, countless amounts of energy surged into the embryonic form of the Divine Seed, causing it to germinate. A minute passed, and Charles gradually felt the seed in his body solidify. As long as he continued to put power into it, it would continue to grow stronger. Just as the Divine Seed was successfully condensed, a large amount of viscous liquid surged up from the ground like a rogue wave. The ground began to cave in, and countless pieces of rock and stone were reduced to gravel. "I think the Deathwater monster is angry," Charles said. He had expected the monster to retaliate, so its ire wasn't a shock to him. He calmly gave orders to Tina and the other two. "Leave this place as fast as you can, and tell anyone nearby not to approach the building. If they insist on ignoring you and decide to come in here anyway, don't bother trying to stop them." Tina and the other two acknowledged the order and left the building without hesitation. None of them wanted to be around for whatever drama was about to unfold. If Charles told them to leave, it meant that they would only be in the way if they stayed. The other thing they considered was that if they stayed to express their loyalty, Charles wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice them if he needed to. The commotion in the building attracted many people's attention. Some of the people who had been frightened away by Charles stopped and looked back. Like watching a train wreck, they were both shocked and curious about what was going on inside. Some of the people who had been further away from the base returned and saw Tina and the others coming out of the ruins. "Hey, what's happening?" one asked. "Tell us what's going on inside, or we'll kill you right here," another said. Tommy remembered Charles's words and shouted to everyone, "Don't go in, it's dangerous inside." He had done his duty by warning them, and just as Charles had suspected, not everyone listened to him. Even though the earth inside the building was shaking, there were still some people who were blindly confident in their own strength. They re-entered the building despite Tommy's warning. Those people who had stopped Tina seemed to hesitate when they saw the others running back into the former base. A man wearing a red outfit looked from the shaking building to the weapons that Tina and the others were holding. Then he stretched out his hand, and a ball of dark blue flame appeared. "I'll give you two choices," he said. "Go back in there in front of me and take a look at what's happening, or I'll kill you right here." The man was under the impression that no paranormal would carry around heavy weaponry. Therefore, it indicated that Tina and the others were either ordinary people or martial artists. Either way, he decided, I am stronger. He had ignited the blue flame in his hand in order to intimidate them, by proving that he was proficient in controlling hellfire. In his mind, it would be easy to control the three strangers. But as he flaunted his hellfire like a middle school bully, Tina's knife erupted into a bright red flame. "Never show your trump card at the beginning of a fight," Tina said. "Is this guy stupid?" She put away her knife and stood aside as the fire element paranormal's body fell to the ground at her feet. She had developed a habit of fighting back the second someone attacked, and she had instinctively drawn her sword the moment the paranormal had summoned his fire. But she wasn't the only one who had attacked. Hugh and Tommy hadn't remained idle during the man's threats either. When the paranormal had flaunted his power, they too had taken the initiative to be more than passing bystanders. The three of them had taken out the man together. But there were witnesses to their act, and soon the retreating crowd had stopped in their tracks to look at Tina, Tommy, and Hugh. "Why did they attack him?" someone asked. Because the retribution had been so fast, no one had seen what the man had done to aggravate them. In their eyes, Tina and the others had been unprovoked and taken the life of an innocent man. Tina and the other two didn't feel good about their victory. They were used to fighting zombies and mutated beasts. None of them enjoyed killing humans. But when they attacked, it was always because their choice was to kill or be killed, whether the fight was against a human or a beast. All the same, they felt slightly guilty for slaying someone who obviously had little to no combat awareness. "Most of these idiots have just walked out of the military fortress," Tina reminded the others. "They aren't familiar with fighting monsters in the outside world yet, but they have some technical knowledge. I'm pretty sure they might even be able to use their strength to crush us. We shouldn't underestimate them. They might be stupid, but they're still trained killers." She felt that she needed to remind her two companions so they didn't assume their opponents were weak. She knew that underestimating their enemies might give them the advantage. Tony and Hugh nodded in agreement, and the three of them scanned their surroundings. When their eyes swept over the area, the people around them involuntarily took a few steps back. Those who had heard Tommy's instructions had been torn, whether to attack them or do what he had said. However, when they saw the fierce way the three of them had attacked the man in red, they quickly chose to retreat. All thoughts of taking on the three newcomers were put aside. The strangers had demonstrated that they were all skilled, as well as ruthless and decisive. The crowd might have had the advantage of numbers, but no one was willing to take the risk of attacking first. They also decided that they weren't going to heed Tommy's warning. As one, the frightened people ran back into the empty base. None of them knew what was going on inside, but they knew they needed to get away from Tina and the others as quickly as possible. As soon as they got through the doors, they all regretted their actions. Cries for help filled the air, and no one knew which way to run. Charles heard a few screams and calls for help from within the deep pit, but he turned a deaf ear. He had already warned them that there was danger in the building. It was their own fault they had come back inside. His conscience was clear, and he shook his head at the crowd's stupidity. His primary focus was the Deathwater monster. Because he had absorbed so much of its energy, he had attracted its attention. The monster had destroyed the life absorption ritual's spell array, but that was of little concern to Charles. The formation had only been part of the ritual. Its function had been to establish a connection between himself and the monster, so that he could absorb its energy. Ordinarily, the ritual created a two-way connection. Both parties could theoretically engage in a tug-of-war until one lost enough soul energy to concede. However, the Deathwater monster didn't have a soul because its chemical composition was completely different from ordinary life forms. Thus, what ought to have been a fair fight had been a one-sided annihilation. Although the monster had ruined the life absorption ritual, that only caused the rate of absorption to slow down. Charles took advantage of the time to constantly dodge the Deathwater monster, avoiding the viscous liquid. When he was unable to avoid it, he used some water to force it into retreat, creating a delay in the pursuit and buying himself more time. This thing is massive, he thought. As he pivoted around the body of water, he was impressed at the creature's size. In his past life, the biggest Deathwater monster he had ever heard of had been less than 50 square feet, but this one was the size of a small pond. He presumed its size was relative to the number of people it had devoured. During the life absorption process, Charles felt the divine seed in his body gradually strengthen, and he also felt as though his body was getting lighter. That feeling was a result of the preservation ability. The Deathwater monster is under the control of stellar technology, he realized. Once he had overcome the initial pressure, the process of dodging the monster's attacks became easy. He also had time to think about some of the more mysterious anomalies he hadn't considered before. When stellar technology was destroyed back then, no one ever found anything like this, he thought. Besides, that company always had enemies. If they had a monster this size, it would have been impossible to hide it. This timeline must be vastly different from the last one. His mind began to race. Stellar technology has an endless supply of materials for its experiments. No matter how many people they use as experimental subjects, they always have enough resources to modify them. Since their base has been raided, I'm sure a lot of important information has been burned out of existence. But what's left should be worth a fortune. Although Charles couldn't find the paperwork to back up his suspicions, he could still take an educated guess. The reason stellar technology has so many resources to transform others is because of Deathwater monster, he thought. They're obviously using some unknown means to forcefully control the monster and extract its energy. Although he was sure someone like Olivia would think he was jumping to conclusions, Charles knew that his theory answered a lot of questions. It would explain how stellar technology had been able to produce so many cyborg beasts. Instead of needing to capture a large number of mutated zombies, they would have used the Deathwater monster to constantly provide themselves with special materials. He also realized that it would explain why the company's genetic advancement drug was so advanced, because they had managed to lay a good foundation from the beginning. As Charles's divine seed strengthened, his senses also improved. He could see through the creature's physical body, and he noticed a particularly strong light spot. Is that the source of the monster's energy? He wondered. The preservation ability gave Charles a terrifying boost to both his attack and defense, and created a type of pure soul energy. When he'd established a connection with the Deathwater monster's energy, he also sensed the chemical composition of the Deathwater monster's body. In his opinion, the monster was a combination of life forms. It had a primary core that kept its unique consistency together. As he continuously extracted its energy, the core weakened. I can't keep weakening it like this, he realized. Charles's intuition told him that the core of Deathwater monster's energy was valuable only in its complete state. If he took away too much energy from the core, its value might decrease. If that's the case, then I need to get it as soon as I can, he thought. With that, the large amount of the creature's energy that he had placed in the energy storage space was instantly refined and merged with his own strength. Because the divine seed was already completely condensed, it significantly enhanced his physical capabilities. That, in turn, made the pure soul energy in his body even purer. My soul energy has been converted into pure soul energy, he thought excitedly. Charles held his hand out, and a wisp of pure soul energy appeared in his palm. He could feel that his pure soul energy was fundamentally different from his previous life. In his previous life, it had been filled with a strong desire to destroy. But in his present life, it seemed to possess both great power and a reverence for life. Is this because of the gate of life and death? He wondered. His speed was so enhanced that simply taking a few steps transported him halfway across the room. The spot where he had been standing previously was quickly submerged. His physical enhancements meant that Charles outstripped the monster with ease. The creature may as well have been crawling. Then the sword of death appeared in Charles's right hand. It seemed to respond to his thoughts almost faster than he could think them. The hilt of the sword disappeared, and Charles pointed his finger. The sword seemed to merge with his arm, becoming an extension of his body. I think I can use my soul energy to strengthen the power of the sword of death, he thought, but I don't think I can push it too far yet. With a vague understanding of how to use the sword of death, Charles raised his hand, and then he brought it down sharply. Some of the waves the monster had sent rushing toward Charles were cut into two by the black sword energy, and something that looked like black flames appeared where the blade met the liquid, burning the Deathwater monster's body. I have enough soul energy to kill it, he thought. Since he had obtained a new divine ability, he was eager to give it a try. So he leaped forward and rushed at the Deathwater monster. The black sword energy flashed again and easily separated the viscous liquid. It cauterized the substance so that it had no way to condense again. As Charles waved his arm, the black sword energy swept across the room. Wherever it passed, the Deathwater monster's body was cut into pieces. All the people who had been absorbed by the Deathwater monster, but not fully digested, were able to escape. They shook the sticky liquid off their bodies, and then they looked at Charles with disbelief. "Is he a human?" one of them asked. "I thought that the monster was immune to all superpowers and physical attacks," someone added. They were astounded to witness the monster that had claimed the lives of so many paranormals and martial arts experts being sliced apart like butter in front of their eyes. Finally, a white stone in the center of the monster was exposed. It was the same bright spot Charles had seen with his enhanced vision. He swung his sword a few times, and the sticky liquid around the stone lost its vitality and splashed harmlessly to the ground. Is this the source of Deathwater monster's energy? Charles wondered again. He quickly pocketed the white stone and barely glanced at the people he had released from the bowels of the monster. He hadn't intentionally saved them. Their release was a subsidiary effect of killing the monster. He neither needed nor wanted their gratitude. Besides, he thought, I've had far too many cases where I treat people I save kindly, and then I'm met with nothing but suspicion. It always seemed to him that people were afraid he would use their gratitude against them, or else they gained a propensity for playing the victim, and assumed that he would always be there to save them. He wasn't the kind of person to do something for nothing. The people he had freed watched as he left the Stellar Technology building. They raced after him and reached out their arms to try and stop him from leaving, but he was untouchable. His dismissive approach to them only seemed to make them more devout. They thought they could be unstoppable if they trained with someone as powerful as him. Charles had no reason to remain in the building once he had taken the stone, and he wanted to leave immediately. But even as his body lost its increased vitality, he realized that there were people underground. It was only due to the fading effects of the preservation ability that he was able to detect their soul energy. "Charles!" Tina cried when he emerged from the building. "Did you kill it?" She and the other two followers rushed to Charles' side with excitement on their faces. "It's not over yet," Charles said seriously. "I managed to kill its physical body. I need you three to use your knives and spears to chop it up, and then bring the pieces to me so I can store them. I'm going to the basement." "What's in the basement?" Hugh asked instinctively. But when he saw the look in Charles's eyes, he immediately regretted asking. Charles wasn't known for explaining his actions to anyone. Charles had meant to frighten them, and he decided to offer an explanation. "I think there's a bunker or a panic room of some kind down there," he said. "I want to see who's hiding in it." Tina and the other two were confused. They didn't dare ask how Charles could sense the existence of a hidden shelter buried under the ground. Charles was known to have accomplished many amazing and unexplainable things, and this was just one more example. While the three of them ran off to get to work, some of the more daring onlookers decided to surround Charles. "What do you want?" he asked them coldly. He gave off such a strong wave of contempt that it successfully managed to make the people nearest to him shiver. Those who were slightly further away also felt a chill rush down the back of their spines. It suddenly dawned on them that this was a man who had killed the Deathwater monster, and that perhaps antagonizing him wasn't the best idea. A young man with a dignified expression approached Charles slowly with an air of reverence. "We didn't mean to offend you," he assured Charles. "We only want to know how to deal with this monster. That way, when we encounter one of them again, we can deal with it ourselves." After the young man had made his request, the other onlookers chimed in. "That's right," said one. "Who knows how many people that monster's killed? If you tell us its weakness, we'll have a much better chance if we ever face it again." "Yeah," said another. "Why keep all your wisdom to yourself?" "Please tell us," said a third, "for the good of humanity." An older man with patches of white in his hair and sideburns locked eyes with Charles. His name was Frederick. "These are desperate times," he said. "The more information we have, the easier we can protect not just ourselves, but everyone else. The way I see it, that's the only way we're going to get through this mess." Everyone nodded in agreement. "Knowledge is power, after all," said the young man. Charles didn't want anything to do with these people. In his experience, people who like to drum up a crowd were usually the ones least confident in their own individual strengths. To his mind, they were usually bullies, relying on the strength of the crowd to get their way. The people who would make it through the apocalypse in one piece were those with the good sense to keep quiet and keep careful watch from the sidelines. They might not have the strength of a great leader or fearless warrior, but they had the preservation instincts to make up for their shortcomings. Charles glared at Frederick. He had never met this man before, but he reminded him of a certain person who, in the future, would try to manipulate Kevin in a similar way. In fact, Charles had come across many Fredericks in his time, who used their supposed moral principles to influence as many vulnerable people as they could. Before long, those vulnerable people would find out that they had been sold a pack of lies. "Okay then," Charles said to the polite young man. "If you really want to know my secrets, let me tell you." His upper lip curled slightly, and a dangerous look flashed in his eyes. It sent a chill down the young man's spine, but he knew that there was no backing out now. "Well, he stammered and looked to the ground. "We would be very grateful." Tina and the other two followers felt that something was wrong with Charles. They wondered why he let himself be so easily swayed by a crowd, and where the fury and cruelty they had grown so used to were hiding. "The method I used just now was a blood ritual," he said. "It demands a great deal of paranormal knowledge from the caster, who has to use blood as a sacrifice. I'd love to demonstrate it in front of everyone, but I already lost too much blood the first time around." He gestured to the gash on his upper arm, which had started to scab over. The young man's scalp prickled. He wanted nothing more than to back away and disappear among the crowd. But Charles looked at him with a smile. "No wonder," he said. "Would you be willing to volunteer so that everyone can see how it's done? Knowledge is power, after all. Isn't that what you said?" The young man could feel the blood pulsing through his body. He racked his brains for any excuse to get out of it, but he could come up with nothing. Frederick chuckled. "If it's just a bit of blood," he said, "I'm sure this young man will be more than happy to comply. After all, it was his idea in the first place. Of course, if you're unwilling, then I..." The man started coughing, first lightly, but then doubling over. Eventually he straightened up and caught his breath. "As I was saying, if you're unwilling, I could volunteer instead." Charles watched the young man, who inwardly cursed Frederick. "That sly old fox knows exactly what he's doing," he thought, pretending he's sick so nobody could ever ask him to volunteer. He took a breath, and then he looked back to Charles. "You said it's a blood ritual," he said. "But does it need to be human blood? How can you prove it?" "I can prove it," called out a voice, and a young woman stepped forward and turned to face the crowd. In fact, everyone here can prove that this man gave a great deal of his own blood for the ritual that killed the monster. She looked genuinely worried as she turned to face the young man. "I was scared for his life, and yet, as you can see, he's still alive and well. If he survived the ritual, I'm sure you'll manage it too." Charles was surprised. She was the same young woman who had tried to convince him not to fight with Brad. Later, when he had fought anyway, she had retreated into the crowd. He didn't blame her for it. In fact, it had made him respect her a little. It had been clear to him that she was a kind person who wasn't afraid of others, but was easily swayed by those around her. And the fact that she had decided to protect herself by stepping back into the crowd had been admirable too. These days, misplaced kindness could bring a person harm, and it was important to know when to retreat to a place of safety. In fact, her warning had been completely in line with Charles's way of thinking. He was happy to offer help to those in need, even if they were strangers. But if they didn't accept it, that was their decision. He would never impose his help on someone with a death wish. "She's right," said someone in the crowd, turning to the young man. "We saw how this guy spent his own blood taking down that monster. If he's willing to do it, you should be too." The people in the crowd were all facing the young man. He felt trapped. He had been the one who had called out with the crowd on his side in the first place, and was startled to find that the tables had turned on him like this. His entire body tensed as he waited for the crowd to descend on him and drag him to Charles, so he was surprised when Charles himself approached. He stepped toward the young man and grabbed his wrist. With his other hand, he pulled a knife from his belt. The young man cried out. He tried to pull his wrist free, but Charles's grip was like a vice. Realizing that he had no way to escape, the man moaned in misery. "Don't you want to learn the ritual?" said Charles in an icy tone. "Here, I'll show you." He cut the man's wrist with his knife. Blood quickly welled up and dripped to the ground. Where it touched the bare earth, a 5-pointed star bloomed, with the young man standing helplessly in the center. "Let go of me!" cried the young man, the pain from his cut wrist searing up his arm. Nobody stepped forward to help him. They wanted to see if the ritual would turn out to be useful. If it ended up helping them protect themselves against a monster like the one they had just seen, what did it matter if it cost this young man's life? In carrying out this ritual, Charles hadn't really cast the life absorption ritual again, but rather had formed a spell array around the young man. Since he had made his contract with Cerberus, he hadn't yet had an opportunity to use the spell array to summon a hellhound. It would have been too dangerous to try it in Dawn City, but since a sacrificial offering had so blatantly presented itself, he was naturally eager to give it a shot. A huge black dog padded out of the light cast by the spell array. It opened its mouth, spilling drool and blood onto the ground. The crowd gasped. Many of the people took a step back, ready to retreat entirely. "Help!" cried the young man. "Save me!" This once polite and refined man had been reduced to a gibbering wreck, focused only on surviving this ordeal. Charles stepped toward the hellhound and laid a hand on his head, passing his aura into the creature's body. He could feel the power of the curse within the hellhound. It was the same curse that had been laid onto Cerberus, and its power was directly proportional to the hound's own strength. Charles also felt the familiar presence of the old master's seal. He knew he just needed to awaken the seal's power and let the hellhound do the rest. As he poured his own energy into the seal, the creature let out a loud roar. It wasn't the howl of a domestic dog, but of a wolf. The hellhound was close in ancestry to the hellish demon wolf, so it wasn't unusual for it to make such an agonizing sound. "No, don't eat me!" screamed the young man. He fell to the ground and scrabbled to get away with no thought to his previous decorum. But it was already too late. Within seconds, the hellhound had finished devouring its offering. Licking its chops, it turned to Charles and bowed its head. It could sense that Charles had sealed off a part of the curse, awakening some of the power of its bloodline. Although Charles hadn't succeeded in dispelling the curse completely, the beast was still surprised by its increased power. "What's going on?" asked Frederick, evidently recognizing that the situation had taken a turn for the worse. He looked for an escape route, but found his path blocked by 3 figures. "Hey, where are you going?" asked Hugh, grabbing Frederick by the arm. "Didn't you just say you'd be willing to demonstrate in that young guy's place?" He shoved Frederick in Charles's direction. Frederick was helpless as he watched the hellhound approach him. He couldn't believe Charles's cruelty. What could bring someone to not only kill an innocent person, but to do so in front of everyone in such a brutal manner? He wondered. his stomach in knots.
Does he just want to show off his terrible power?
But before he could do anything, the Hellhound was upon him. The air filled with Frederick's final screams before silence descended. Charles turned back to the crowd with a cold stare, and many of the onlookers scrabbled to escape. "We were wrong," one of them shouted. "We didn't see anything." As far as they were concerned, two demons stood in front of them, the monstrous Hellhound and the man who had summoned it. Charles smiled in satisfaction, watching the crowd break apart and disperse, running as fast as they could. This was a good lesson, he thought. This'll wake them up to what kind of world we're living in now. High-minded moralizing won't help them anymore. That'll show them how naive they've been all this time, he said to Tina, Hugh, and Tommy. Then he turned to the young woman who had spoken up on his behalf. She was the only member of the crowd who hadn't fled, but she was pale and speechless. She covered her eyes and called out, "I didn't see anything just now. I didn't hear anything. Just please don't kill me." Is feeding these people to the Hellhound the only way of shutting them up? Charles wondered with a sigh. The young woman lowered her hand, relieved to see that Charles had shown no sign of chasing after the fleeing onlookers. She had thought he would certainly kill her for witnessing the deaths of the two men, but now she realized that he was hardly about to kill every single person in the crowd who had seen what had happened here. "Why did you kill those two?" she asked. "I don't think you're a bad person, but surely they didn't deserve that." Not a bad person, thought Tommy, sharing glances with Tina and Hugh. If she'd seen the way he took care of those Stellar Technology soldiers a few days ago, she wouldn't dare to judge whether he was a good or a bad person. "You're bold," Charles said. "You've just escaped mortal danger, and now you're blaming the very person who threatened you in the first place." "You won't kill me," she said. He smiled. "You think those two people didn't deserve to die?" he asked. "That's right," she said with confidence. But then she took a step back. "If they were so innocent," he said, "then why were they taking such great pains to stir up the crowd against me? Isn't that a crime in itself?" The young woman was stunned. At first she couldn't even follow Charles's line of reasoning. What kind of logic is that? She thought. He's saying that by calling him out, these two men have been, what, rallying the crowd to take him on? So then he'd have had to kill all of them too? Even Hugh, Tina, and Tommy were frowning, unable to buy into this line of thought. Of course they had witnessed Charles's ruthlessness before, but with this most recent turn of events, they had learned that he was operating with a completely different set of moral standards. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but backed away when she saw the serious look in Charles's eyes. "Say that someone stronger than these two had demanded I spill my secrets," he said. "What do you think would have happened then? If my secrets get out, there'll be no reason for people to follow me. They'd stir up the crowd to take me down, and what kind of justice is that? But then think about it this way. If I can keep my secrets and my influence, then I can use them to help others." The young woman opened her mouth, but quickly closed it again. Against her better judgment, she could see that there was some truth to his words. She had heard about similar situations before, where paranormals who had tried their best to protect everyone had been killed by a jealous crowd. This kind of thing was common enough that it had led to general hostility between the paranormals and ordinary people. In fact, she herself was a paranormal and had come close to experiencing such things herself. Many thought that it would be fair to share the knowledge of the paranormals' powers among as many people as possible. After all, the more people privy to the knowledge, the greater their chances would be against the enemy. If those people had taken the next step and inspired the crowd to rise up against me, Charles continued, I would have had no choice but to counterattack and kill everyone. And in the chaos, those two cowards who started the mess could have easily fled before I had a chance to punish them. The woman thought back to Frederick's escape attempt, which gave her pause. Likewise, she couldn't help reflecting that Frederick had, in part, caused the young man's death by suggesting that he volunteer in Charles's demonstration. If it hadn't been for Frederick, the young man might still be alive. And then, to add insult to injury, after seeing things turn so sour, Frederick had immediately turned tail and tried to run. She didn't doubt that, had Charles let him get away, he would have carried on tricking people into putting themselves in danger to save his own skin. Do you still believe them to be innocent? Charles asked. Or was I right to bring them to justice? She shook her head. She couldn't decide. Since the legal system had collapsed, the main reason people didn't commit crimes was that it was rarely worth the hassle, or that in towing the line, they would be more likely to be left alone to do their own thing. But with no system for punishing criminals, it clearly didn't take much for people to give in to their baser instincts. "Tell me," Charles said, "why did you come here?" "We were offered money and protection," she said. "As long as we could bring them useful research data, we were promised food and shelter. That's the main reason most of us joined." "Ah," said Charles. "And you really believe the person who offered you this?" "You must have met a real swindler," said Tommy. But they were living in a world where just surviving was a struggle enough. When this woman had been approached with a promise, not only of survival, but some degree of comfort, of course she had agreed. "Don't be so ignorant," she said. "Any one of you would have accepted the same thing, especially considering how important and rich this person was. It was clear he had the means to live up to his promises." "I'd like to meet such an important man," Tina said with a sneer. "Don't think you can look down on everyone just because you're strong," said the woman. Although she was young, there was hard-won wisdom in her bearing. She thought for a moment before saying, "Anyway, the people who promised us these rewards have a strength like you've never seen. Do you know why this place was turned into ruins? It was because of their leader, this big shot. He took down a whole army, tens of thousands of soldiers." Tina opened her mouth but closed it when she saw the look in Charles's eyes. Hugh and Tommy likewise glanced from the woman to Charles to see his reaction. They knew that he didn't take kindly to flattery, but weren't sure how he would respond, since the young woman clearly didn't know who he was. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "You must be talking about the mayor of Dawn City," he said. "Are you sure all these things you've heard about him are true?" "Of course," said the woman. "He's strong and ruthless. He's killed tens of thousands of soldiers and just as many zombies. Who would dare to lie about such a man?" She spoke with the passion of an adoring fan enthusing over her idol. Mayor Federer personally issued the order. He said that anyone who could provide some useful research could move into Dawn City and join his personal guard. If we could bring him anything of interest, we wouldn't need to worry about living outside anymore, or being preyed on by criminals or zombies. How could we doubt the intentions of such a generous man? After she had finished gushing over Charles's deeds, the young woman looked around at the four of them, grinning. "Now that everyone's scared away and that monster's dead," she said, "we can finally make some headway with our research." She reached out a hand to Charles. "Let me introduce myself. My name is Helen Beckett. It seems we were destined to meet. If we can uncover some important piece of research data, I'd say we stand a good chance of joining Dawn City together." "The people on your side were scared off by our boss," said Tina. "Why would we join up with someone who is associated with such a pack of cowards?" Helen was embarrassed. She realized that she had let herself get a little carried away. It was true that the rest of her people had been scared away by this man, whoever he was. How could she expect him to help her gather the research they needed to access Dawn City? But it wasn't in her nature to give up. "I'm not just any old paranormal," she said. "I'm a healer." She raised her hand and opened it flat. An orb of green light appeared in her palm. "It doesn't matter how strong your team is, you can always use a healer." Charles raised his eyebrow. "You're a wood-powered paranormal?" As Charles had read in his ancient text, paranormals were divided into two general categories: elemental and bio-altered. The elemental category contains 6 types, comprising the 4 classical elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, as well as light and darkness. Elemental paranormals could use the soul energy of heaven and earth to channel powers centered on their respective element. They were the strongest paranormals and were a vital asset to any team. Meanwhile, the bio-altered category contained 4 types: lightning, space, metal, and wood. Unlike the elemental paranormals, they couldn't use their soul energy directly to fight, but they were able to absorb elements into their bodies and use their soul energy to control them in battle. Although the healing ability of the wood element wasn't as strong as that of the light element, it was still clear to Charles that a paranormal with such an ability would be a huge asset. After a certain level, such a paranormal could even heal internal injuries. Such a skill would be particularly useful when treating those of the older generations, as well as to aid those suffering from energy deviation. Helen registered Charles's look of surprise. "Let me join your team," she said. "I'll be so helpful, and my healing ability is different from others. Other healers need protection on the battlefield, but I'm very skilled in martial arts cultivation techniques, and I'm fast. You won't need to worry about me. I'll pay my way, I promise." Paranormals with martial arts cultivation skills were very rare. Although they were strong, they were liable to overspend their energy and fall risk to energy deviation. As a wood-power paranormal, though, Helen didn't need to worry about such an issue. Tina, Tommy, and Hugh looked at Charles with concern, but he nodded and said, "It sounds like a good idea. But tell me, why haven't you joined any team until now? I'd imagine someone with your skills would be very popular. And besides, why have you chosen us?" No matter who they are, he thought, a healer is very valuable. Not to mention one who can fend for herself on the battlefield. It just doesn't make sense that she hasn't been snapped up by a team already. At first, Helen looked uneasy. "First of all, you're all clearly very strong," she said. "Even though I don't need your protection, it's clear that you'd be a powerful group to ally with. Second, everything you said just now about those two men, well, it's a pretty messed up theory, but these are messed up times, so I trust your principles." She turned to look in the direction in which her people had fled. "You saw how quickly my last team abandoned me. I need a group who sticks together, and you strike me as just that sort of group." Charles nodded. He had come across many smart people in his time, but few had been as worldly wise as Helen. He agreed with her that she shouldn't give a second thought to the group that had so willingly abandoned her. As far as he was concerned, the only reason somebody would try to reconnect with a team that had betrayed them was to pretend to forgive them while waiting for an opportunity to take revenge on them. It reminded him of a saying from his past life: "Forgive the ones who steal your food, but never the ones who break their promises." In addition, he was moved that Helen clearly judged the four of them worthy of her trust, and so he was prepared to accept her onto his team. Tina, Tommy, and Hugh felt a mild sense of panic at the unfolding situation, but they did their best to conceal it. It wasn't their place to interfere with Charles's decisions. If they spoke out simply because they were jealous of this newcomer, it would ruin his opinion of them. "Very well," said Charles. "Welcome to the team. Now let's see what treasures we can find in all this rubble." Helen was speechless. "I'm in," she thought before joining in the hunt. "Go and dig that place open," he said to the Hellhound, pointing to a corner of the area. Then he turned to Tina, Tommy, and Hugh. "Come over here and help. Sounds like this Mayor Federer guy is offering hefty rewards in exchange for the right goodies. So let's see what we can find." The three of them stared at him, lost for words. It was unnerving to see the lengths to which he was willing to go to keep up the facade that he wasn't in fact the mayor that Helen was clearly so enamored by. Obviously, he was set on keeping his cover for a while yet, and they didn't dare do anything that might expose him. As they sorted through the ruins, they were united by another question also shared by Charles. If Charles hadn't issued the reward that this woman spoke of, then who had? There weren't many people in Dawn City who would dare to assume Charles's name, let alone make promises on his behalf. They were determined to get to the bottom of it. "What's your name, by the way?" Helen asked as they searched through the rubble. "I haven't asked yet." For some reason, she felt that she could trust this man. He was at least more trustworthy than a lot of the other men she had met on her travels through the unforgiving post-apocalyptic world. "My name is Johnny Federer," he said. "I guess now would be as good a time as any to let you know. I'm related to Mayor Federer." She paused in her search to look him up and down, trying to assess if he was being serious or not. "So you're telling me you're brothers?" she asked. She had meant it as a joke, but she recoiled when she saw Charles's serious look. She took a breath. "If you really are related to the mayor, how come you didn't know about the reward?" Charles didn't respond. He merely shifted some rocks around. "Still," continued Helen, "you have the same last name, and you seem almost as strong as him. Even if you can't bring in any research data, I'm sure he'll still let you join." Charles simply nodded. "I've heard that he gives rewards according to people's contribution, but don't worry. With your strength and my support, I'm sure we'll find something to win him over." Again, he merely nodded as though in full agreement. Then he turned to the Hellhound. The beast had originally been at level 4, but it reached level 5 after he had sealed the curse that had been stemming its bloodline power. Its strength was now much greater than before. He could sense, too, that a new mark had appeared within Cerberus' loyalty mark on his arm. This meant that the Hellhound had acknowledged him as its master, so if he needed to summon a Hellhound again, he would have direct access to this one, reducing the cost of summoning it all. "Found something?" called out Hugh. "There's a secret room over here." Charles pointed in Hugh's direction. The Hellhound bounded over and started to sift through the debris with its paws, uncovering a metal door. "It must be a secret chamber," gasped Helen, her eyes lighting up. "I bet there's something really important inside. Research data or not, Mayor Federer is bound to be impressed." "Tell me something," said Charles as they waited for the Hellhound to clear the space around the door. "You just watched me send 2 people to their deaths and still wanted to join my team. Likewise, this Mayor Federer has clearly killed many people, too, and yet you seem to worship him. Why?" Helen sighed. "In this world," she said, "killing people is unavoidable. Even I've had to kill to defend myself. It's hard to stick to your principles when things are so messed up. It's also hard to know which people to kill and which to spare." Charles was a little taken aback to find that someone as young as Helen had killed before. Again, he couldn't help feeling admiration for her. She had clearly had little problem adjusting her attitude to meet the realities of this new world. In the new era, it was important to be prepared to do whatever it took to survive. Soon after, the Hellhound cleared the doorway of debris. Tommy gripped his spear tightly, and Hugh ducked to one side with his knife raised, while Tina cautiously stepped forward to cut a path through it with her sword. The 3 of them had learned a lot from their time with Charles. They knew they could never let their guard down. Seeing how careful they were being, Helen also put her guard up, preparing herself for whatever was on the other side. Charles noticed her body tense and silently praised her. He knew that the people who were to survive these times would be those who knew their weaknesses as well as their strengths. This ensured that they were ever vigilant and wouldn't make any rash mistakes. He had been worried that Helen would prove as careless as anyone else of her age, so was surprised and heartened to see her on such high alert. Tina plunged her scarlet flame blade into the door, slicing through its thick metal so cleanly that it didn't even make a sound. Helen frowned. "She didn't use her powers at all," she said. "Just the sharpness of her blade, right?" "Yes," said Charles. "I used some special materials to make weapons for my team. They cut through iron like mud." "Wow. It sounds like we really won't have any problems getting into Dawn City." Then a worry occurred to her. "I'm not sure how I can compete with the 4 of you," she said. "What's to stop you from abandoning me if you don't think I'm pulling my weight?" "If it's true what you say," said Charles, "and you don't need protection in battle, then with your healing powers, I'm sure you'll more than pull your weight. Remember that when your old team abandoned you, it wasn't a reflection on you, but on them." She nodded. "I can't believe they left me," she said. "They looked so ridiculous running away from your dog like that." She felt anger rising afresh, but did her best to push it down. Although she hated her teammates for abandoning her, there was no sense in thinking of revenge when she had a new team. Besides, at the end of the day, the important thing wasn't that she find a team that accepted her, but that she was able to fend for herself. Meanwhile, Charles went through some ruminations of his own. "I wonder," he thought, "why did she hide behind me when I summoned the Hellhound? Does she feel safe with me?" Tina slashed through the door and kicked it in, sending it clattering into the room beyond. "You guys are amazing," said Helen, awestruck. On the other side of the door, they found 10 researchers in white coats, shocked and with their hands up, crowded inside what amounted to a cramped living space. A table held some silver cutlery, as well as candles and cakes. Clearly, this was some kind of hidden shelter. "Sorry to crash your party," said Charles. "Looks like you're living quite the high life in here." He smiled at them cruelly as he entered the room.